Title: Carried by the Wind. Written by Arya. If there was one thing Ryan was right about, it was the passing of time. The older Barbados got, the faster it all seemed to pass by. His people had children, grew old, and suddenly, at least 4 generations had passed since he became an Archon. We don't experience time the same way, she had told him in her rare visits. Perhaps she came over so often because she felt bad she was the one who had confined him to one eternity ahead. But he never regretted his decision. But that doesn't make it any less precious. It's because our people live such short lives that we accompany them for as long as we can and guide them to the future we'll be there to see. Do you think of them as your people too? He asked. She had taken his hands in hers, as she was so prone to do. I think of you as my people. So the people you love, I love. The people that are yours are mine. He had an eternity, but he only wanted to spend it with her. And the same for you. If there's anything you need, all you have to say is the word. Look at you, learning how to sweet talk. Don't miss me too much now, my dear Barbados. I'll be seeing you in a bit. A bit for mortals could be months or years, decades, hundreds of years. Whenever the thought occurred to them, thousands of years later, Wayan was no better than any other immortal in that respect. But he wasn't one to start getting too clingy. Still, just a few months after she set off for Leeway once more for that friend of hers, did he decided it was worthwhile seeing the same sights as she did. When he wandered into one of the small villages nearby in search of her, it only took one moment to catch sight of her drinking and chattering away at one of the small pavilions outside. She turned to him and positively glowed, raising an arm in greeting. The cup she held sloshed a little, her drink trickling down her arm, but she didn't seem to mind. He brought herself to her side as she finished off the rest of her drink, face still warm from her slight inebriation. You didn't tell me you were coming, she near announced to the entire village before hooking an arm around the shoulder of the man sitting calmly beside her. This is Morax, she said, half shouting into the poor man's ears. And this is Gui Zhang. The woman beside her smiled calmly, waving, as Ryan continued waving her cup around, before clumsily handing it to him. He drank the rest in one gulp and only then realized how she had led him down the wrong path. It had a nice, sweet aftertaste and he set the cup back down at the table. Her friends fell into amiable silence as Guizhong put a hand over her mouth and Morak sighed, peeling wine off of him. She grinned and leaned over on the table, closing her eyes as her cheeks pressed against the wood. You were the one from Mondstadt, Guizhong began, gently draping her fingers over Wayan's cheek, pulling closer into her touch. I apologize if I anticipated your arrival. I would have duly prepared. It's fine. I didn't think I'd be coming over too. He wasn't sure if he should sit or not, hovering in the space before them like an intruder. Is she asleep? Guizhong leaned in closer before nodding. Yes, she's been drinking the whole morning. I apologize for her unseemly state. No worries. I have seen worse, to be honest. Indeed. He was starting to associate her with a bottle of wine in one hand and a glass of liquor in the other. If there was any silver lining, it was that she was a very agreeable drunk who willingly let herself be carried off to bed in the aftermath. Does she do this often with you guys? Oh, for sure. I think it's endearing though. Morax? It's alright. The man tapped his finger against the table slowly, building a careful rhythm. She's too carefree though. Guizhong sighed. Temperament, gentle despite her scolding tone. And I've told you that's perfectly fine. It's not like she'll get mugged for being so easygoing. She will be. She won't be. Don't be so cynical. She is still an Archon. Not a very aware one, Morax insisted. But truthfully, Barbados saw nothing but fondness in his eyes as he looked down at her. For a moment, he dropped his smile, staring intently at the two Archons hovering over YN, both affectionate in their own distinct ways. Morak's eyes rose and met Barbados. Will you take her back? Guizhong whipped her head around to stare at him, but Morax remained firm. He could only form his hesitant question. You want me to take her back? With careful precision, Morax lifted her up by the armpits like a child, before dumping her into Barbados' arms rather unceremoniously. It's just down the street a bit. You can ask the locals where the inn is. By some miracle, Guizhong seemed to catch on to whatever Morax was trying to do, because she broke into a sweet smile and nodded enthusiastically. You can't miss it. Having been given the burden of his drunk friend, who was compliant as he shifted her weight around his shoulders and inadequate height, he could only sigh and agree with the two scoundrels. No problem. I'll go drop her off. No promises how long I'll take though. That's fine. We've had enough drinking for the day anyways. Morax, should we go patrolling again? The two departed a little too fast to be casual, but Barbados had no time to question their integrity. Curled into his side was one very drunk Archon, still mumbling something under her breath about flowers and wine. Once an alcoholic, always one, he supposed, even in a questionable state of consciousness. He took a few steps forward, and once she realized someone was taking her back to a warm bed, she clumsily stepped alongside him, slipping every few steps. He was there to brace himself against the floor and barely prevent the two of them from toppling onto the ground. So at least they were making some sort of progress. She was sobering up just a bit, however, enough to point out every little thing she saw by digging her heels into the ground and making sure he turned to see. She stopped there for one of these moments, squinting at a bird pecking away at the dirt. Look, there's a bird. When he didn't immediately turn his head, she grabbed his cheeks with her palms and forcefully turned him into the direction of the bird, which had since flown away under such serious scrutiny. I see it, he said, just to console her. Satisfied, she once again fell into a companionable silence, and Barbados continued lodging her down to the street and to the hotel. The moment he stepped in, the man at the counter nodded knowingly, as if this wasn't the first time. I'll get you her room, he said, reaching behind him for a set of keys. Barbados could only accept them and follow the man's direction up the stairs down the hall, and into their best room at the very end. He hauled her into the room and gently set her down to the bed. He attempted to, at least, but she was far taller than he was, and when she flopped down, she dragged him down with her until they both hit the bed. Oops, she said, but instantly began dozing off as if she wasn't crushing him to death. I need my arm for the lyre. He made a half-hearted attempt to extract himself out of her iron grip, and she wiggled a little, giving his poor arm a little room to breathe. Of course, if he lost it, he could simply just grow it back. But he liked being dramatic. She had been looking at him with half-lidded eyes, but now she was closing them again, breathing evenly. Really? You're going to sleep in the afternoon? She cracked her eyes open again, face flushed with wine. Isn't it the best time for nap? You should take one too. It's a great waste of time. Time. He certainly had plenty of that, and he would for a very long time. Lengthy beyond human comparison. What was an afternoon spent napping? All right. He lay his head back down, and though he said he would be napping, he couldn't sleep. He only watched the person lying across from him fall asleep once more, chest rising and falling subtly. The sun stretched across the room, bathing her in warm light, and she curled in on herself further like a sunbathing cat. When he reached across to brush a wayward strand of hair off her cheek, she didn't react. He let his fingers linger for a moment before he drew back as if burned. With a sigh, he turned onto his back and stared at the ceiling instead, closing his eyes after a moment of quiet contemplation. How silly of him to be so whipped over his friend, stealing glances like a little lover and acting all intimate with the same person who had given his country freedom. Bitter as it was sweet, liberating as it was damning. Are these the emotions you gave to me with my name? Am I going to feel this forever? He put no name to the tightness in his chest and warmth in his cheeks. letting his consciousness fade away into the closest approximation of sleep an Archon could get, while still being aware enough to respond to any threats. He walked with her along the shores of Inazuma and collected pretty shells while she pointed to the bright red torii in the distant horizon. Barbados walked at the same time as she did, who was more content to roll around and try to sleep again. She met his eyes across the small space between them, close enough for him to see every little spark in her eyes. "Are you hungry?" she asked, beaming with enough joy to melt a full-grown man. "Sorry, you just ended up sleeping the whole day with me." "That's fine." He really did think it was. Although, if she were to offer him something sweet like apple pie, he wouldn't turn her down. "Knowing you, I already suspected it." "Oh, how ruthless." Still, she looked hardly hurt at all. That was their sort of relationship, trading the occasional quip to be met with melodramatic explanation, and then a period of comfortable silence. He drank in the sound of her quiet breathing as she looked at him like one would with the world. "We should go for a walk then. To be honest, there's not really a lot here, so we can just look at the stars." She stumbled to her feet, having gone through most of her intoxication, but not all. Barbados rose quickly to grab her shoulders, steadying her in the darkened room. Moonlight guided their actions, and when she looked at him, he could only see her eyes illuminated by a slant of moonlight. Slashed across her face, she turned to the window and quickly unlatched it, moving away from Barbados to hop onto the windowsill and reach her hands up to grasp at the rooftop ledge. He watched her clamber onto the roof before poking her head down into the room. "Don't worry, I do this all the time. Can you grab that bottle on the drawer before you come up?" He turned his head, and he did indeed find an innocuous bottle of wine sitting on its lonesome. He reached out to take a hold of it before following her up onto the rooftop. She was already lying on her back, gazing up at the stars. She lifted her head a little, hearing him come up, and quickly patted the area beside her. When he did lie down, she reached out for the wine bottle, uncorked it with a slight tug of her fingers, and took a drink without reservation. "Don't let Morax and Guijong hear you, but I think Mondstadt has the best wine." She sighed anyways, passing the bottle over to him with an impish grin. "But Lewis will have some good stuff. Don't be shy. I can get this anytime." Seeing her insist so much, he took a small sip and was pleasantly surprised to find that it was easier on the palate than most of the drinks she liked to chug. He didn't want to seem like a burgeoning alcoholic, however, so he passed it right back to her. "Do you like stargazing?" "Sometimes. Just a little bit." The fondness in her eyes when she looked to the skies felt more just a little, but he didn't argue. "It's better with a friend. Like you." She drank again, pressing the bottle back into his hand as she returned her gaze to the expanse of stars. When he looked at her, he saw the culmination of decades of the same heavy feeling, undiminished by time. If she noticed, she said nothing of it, looking at him the same way she always did. "Where will you go after this?" "Across the sea to Sishnaya. I hear they've got seafood this..." She stretched out her hands, now exaggerated in its size. "Big. If possible, you should come with me." I'm sorry." He wished he could, but he had his obligations, which she understood. "Maybe in the future." With one eye open and the other closed, she peered at him through the thick glass of her wine bottle, not looking disappointed at all. "I know. I thought you'd say that, but it's fine." She set the bottle down on the roof before stretching out eyes tracing pattern he couldn't see in the sky. "I wouldn't go for a while though. Guijong asked if I could help her for a bit, and I couldn't exactly say no to her." She seemed to remember something then, because she scooted closer to him with the same wide adoring eyes of her. "Actually, what do you think of them? You met them today, right?" He thought back to the two. Guijong had been the prettier, more elegant of the two, and she was kind. That was good. Morax seemed to be the more brutish one, but even he was still soft on his two friends. "They're fun," he said, though he didn't think he'd be playing with them much. Aren't they? She seemed positively thrilled at his words, and she rolled back and forth energetically. We'll have to do something together before you go back. I'm glad you like them though. They're like family to me, just as you are to me. Without thinking, Barbados reached out to brush her hair behind her ear. Suddenly enamored with her appearance under the starlight, she let him. Eyes curved into warm crescents and then she closed her eyes. He imagined they had eternity in that moment. Tightly grasped within their fingers, they shared a wordless love with no labels. The moment passed in relative silence, and when he finally drew back his hands, she only looked at him as she always had. I missed you, my dear Barbados, she said. I missed you too, he wanted to say, but the words couldn't quite come out. He was overwhelmed with such love he could hardly speak, let alone enunciate such a wide breadth of emotions in 4 words. You are my reason for living, he didn't say, the one who gave me such freedom and emotions to begin with. He said nothing, but she smiled anyways. I know. Me too. The next he heard of her was during the Archon War. Guizhong and Morax were among the few names that come up often, and he knew Wyan had not yet moved on. She presided over travels, but she put her loved ones first. This he knew very well. Though he had faith in her, he couldn't help but think of her some days. Even while taking care of his own business, immortal she may be, but careful she was not. He thought of her openness, drinking all she wanted during the daytime and sleeping all she wanted in the afternoon. He thought of her pulling him along at night, threading past the stalls and weaving through the crowds of Liwe. Someone like her was meant to stay on her feet, traveling from place to place, unable to settle down. It wasn't in her blood, the same way her kindness flowed through every vein and really count on her to get stuck in a war she had little interest in. The Argon War. Still, he was more preoccupied with his people, and though he thought of her often, he didn't think to inquire after her. Wyan was like a pet cat, slinking around outside on days on end before returning. Though, in her case, days meant years. This was all context, of course, for why he didn't even think there was something wrong until it was Morax that sent word to him. He didn't even think that he could write, truth be told. YN. Urgent. That was all that was relayed to him. But just those 2 words set his mind racing and his heart pounding. He shed his mortal skin and flew to the location listed at the back of the parchment. Praying with all his heart, nothing had happened. And then he wandered into a grove of flowers, the beauty of which was not lost on him. They glittered a bright, almost harsh gold. Here came the same steely voice, but even now he could recognize the sorrow in them. He stepped forward, almost too scared to see. The flowers yielded under his feet, gentle as he stepped, and he approached the large tree unfurling before him. Beneath its canopy and resting at its roots lay the one person he was most scared of finding there. YN, he murmured and knelt down. From his peripheral vision, Morax only sighed to himself and gave one last mournful glance towards her before he turned and left, leaving them a final moment of privacy. Barbados, she called back weakly, reaching a hand out to brush his cheeks affectionately. Her hands were ice cold, and at some point he could even see translucency. Sorry, was it hard to find me? I begged Morax to take me somewhere nice. YN, he murmured again, and grasped the hand at his cheeks with his. You can't be. Guizhong passed before me. Her voice was only a whisper, one he had to strain himself to hear. It was nothing like the comfortable volume she normally spoke at. So, it was only natural I accompany her too, right? There were so many things wrong with that, but he could only focus on the one tearing him apart the most. But what about me? This was all too sudden. losing the one person who had been there all his life as an Archon. He had grown so used to her, knowing that she would one day return and they would spend the day frolicking and chatting. They would smile at each other in their strange relationship, love in every single way possible. There has to be some way. I can't just. Don't, she warned him. But even she had no more strength left to berate him. That's a dangerous path, Barbados. I did not name you to shackle you to my existence. You didn't, he exclaimed. And to his horror, the fingers he clasped onto so tightly only seemed to fade away further. I did on my own. She smiled again, but this time it was different. She looked so sad, beholding him in her eyes. There was the same deep affection which had almost pervaded her expression but lined in guilt. I'm sorry for leaving you behind, she didn't say, but he could hear it all the same. Don't be like that, she said, as if consoling a child. Live, Barbados. I gave you a name for your own sake. We are immortal. Sooner or later, I too will become a beautiful memory of yours, and nothing else. I don't want you to be. She only raised her other free arm weakly, pulling him into her embrace. There was nothing to be felt but the slightness of her body, now that she was already in the process of fading away, and the coldness of the dead. Why, and please don't. Don't be so sad either. She gently scolded him, pulling him out of her arms to face him head on, eyes glimmering despite her slow death. We are immortal, Barbados. I'll live on if you remember me every once in a while. I'll be the wind, the flowers, the waters rushing from Liyue to Mondstadt, just to meet you once more. Isn't that nice? You've got nothing but the future to look to now, and I want to look to you. Even her legs now fell to the same curse, fading into the sunlight that was already beginning to sink below the horizon. I have always loved you. Perhaps this was something he had to say, since he had long grown out of that guileless wind sprite and into an Archon, no longer someone she could casually glimpse into the thoughts of. Love. She laughed a bit, eyes closing, out of fatigue or just because she was reminiscing. He had no way of knowing. I know, Barbados. Me too. Isn't that natural? Unsaid or said, she was implying it was all the same. He knew and she knew the same things. But they danced around each other in smiles and pretty words. But he wanted to say it, because if not now, then he would never get the chance to. Why, Anne? He repeated. He couldn't say anything else. What could you say to the most important person in your life at their deathbed? Important couldn't even encapsulate what she was to him. She had given him everything when all he had in return was the promise of beautiful sky. And that now, the only remnant of Mondstadt's ancient history he had left was leaving him too. Why, Anne? He called her name like a lifeline, as if repeating it enough would bring her back. Barbados, she repeated, almost breathlessly. The last of the sun sank from view, and illuminated by the faint glow of the tree, she opened her eyes once more. Could you play me something? Within moments, he summoned a lyre to his hands and delicately plucked at the strings, hoping his hands would stay steady. He was halfway through his tune when she sighed once more, eyes meeting his. What's this? She asked. It's nice. He had written it for her. Once upon a time, and thought nothing of it. He had believed there were plenty of opportunities to show off his musical skill. Who could have known he'd be playing it at her dying moments? It nearly soured his playing, but decades of practice had honed his fingers if not his mind. It's for you, he said. That's sweet. She yawned this time, holding up fingers he could hardly see. I'll have to hear the rest later. Why, he called once more, and quickly set aside his lyre. He hadn't noticed his tears until she made a vain attempt to wipe them away. But at that point, she couldn't even touch him. He leaned into her hand anyways, and she only sighed once more, looking up at him with such love he would recall it for the rest of his immortal life. Don't look so sad. She looked at him. And bother Morax for me, will you? It can't be easy losing two friends. I will, he promised her, because what else could he say to a dying woman? I'll bother him until he gets sick of me. Take care of yourself too. He could hardly see her now, and only her faint voice keeping him grounded. He wanted nothing more than to go back. Back to when he was a newly born Archon. Back to the last time they had met in Liyue, so he could tug on her sleeve and ask her to go back with him to Mondstadt and hide out at the war's reach. Now he would be alone once more, with only the memory of her voice to accompany him, brilliant until the day she died, smothered by the greed of gods. And until we meet again, my dear Barbados.